ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hi there, it's PK from the new podcast Politics Now. Sam Hawley will be with you in a second for ABC News Daily, but I just want to tell you about my new podcast Politics Now. As news breaks, we'll bring you the latest analysis in your feed. It's called Politics Now and you can find us on the ABC Listen app.
Donald Trump declared Ukraine had started the war with Russia and labelled its leader a dictator. His vice president, JD Vance, threw his support behind far-right parties in Germany. And talks on ending the war began with only the US and Moscow at the table. It was a week where we saw an extraordinary shift in American foreign policy, which led to European leaders holding crisis talks in Paris. Today, Dr. Samir Puri, Director of Chatham House's Centre for Global Governance and Security, on how it's all unfolded and the consequences that could follow. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Samir, I want to start at this security conference in Munich, where at one point the US Vice President, JD Vance, took to the stage.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all the gathered delegates and luminaries.
Tell me who was watching on at that point.
Sure. So I was actually at the later parts of the Munich Security Conference, and it was a real blizzard of snow outside, and it was a pretty cold temperature inside as well. Yes. The attendees, of course, a lot of Germans, a lot of military officers from Germany and from fellow NATO countries, so lots of people in uniform, lots of older German politicians, lots of older European politicians. But I would tell you that the impression I got was that of a stunned theatre audience where the performer has offended all of their sensibilities.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within.
And they're sitting there understandably thinking, how dare you come to our homes and basically engage in election interference, which is what Vance did indirectly by not talking about European security, not really talking about military matters, as is the conference's billing, but talking about Germany's and Europe's domestic populist parties.
Which, of course, brings us back to Munich, where the organizers of this very conference have banned lawmakers representing populist parties on both the left and the right from participating in these conversations.
So just run me through some of the most shocking things that he actually told that audience.
Well, there was a joke in which he said, well, if we in the US can survive years of Greta Thunberg scolding, then you can survive a few months of Elon Musk. That joke was met with absolute silence.
You guys can survive a few months of Elon Musk.
Imagine bales of hay blowing past, kind of silence. But it really was focused on, this is his words, not mine, to paraphrase, that Europe's elites have ignored a section of their populace who tend to vote for far-right and right-wing political parties, and that means that Europe's own commitment to its democratic principles is in question.
No voter on this continent went to the ballot box to open the floodgates to millions of unvetted immigrants. But you know what they did vote for? In England, they voted for Brexit, and agree or disagree, they voted for it.
Just tell me, how did the audience react? I know they were shocked, but afterwards, who came out? What did they say?
Well, I think it's what they said and what they did. The German Defence Minister, Boris Pistorius, was seen very visibly angry at this and then hastily rewrote his own speech and delivered a rebuke.
Diese Demokratie Our democracy was called into question earlier by the US Vice President. He spoke of the end of democracy and, if I understood him correctly, he compared conditions in parts of Europe with those in authoritarian regimes. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not acceptable.
And that French presidential invitation to Paris on the Monday for Europe's prime ministers and presidents to attend to work out what to do, that was a direct outcome of this weekend's events in Munich. So it's not as if it was just angry words and furrowed brows. There was actual action.
Two main things have come out of the emergency talks with European leaders in Paris overnight: a renewed pledge to protect Ukraine from Russia and a promise from Europe to put its money where its mouth is. British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer will head to Washington next week to meet US President Donald Trump.
Only a lasting peace in Ukraine that safeguards its sovereignty will deter Putin from further aggression in the future.
So, Samir, this has all come, of course, at this point when Donald Trump is trying to negotiate some sort of peace deal, mainly with Vladimir Putin.
Russia wants to do something. They want to stop the savage barbarianism. I mean, what's going on over there? Its soldiers are being killed by the thousands on a weekly basis. It's ridiculous.
Now, this week, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, travelled to Saudi Arabia to meet Russian ministers.
I came away today convinced that they are willing to begin to engage in a serious process.
This was a meeting about a way forward to end the war in Ukraine, but Ukraine and European leaders were entirely excluded from it, weren't they?
Yes, and Zelenskyy initially said he was going to travel to Saudi Arabia and then decided to not do so, in his words, or his office's words, to not implicitly endorse the Russia-USA meeting.
Ukraine will not take part. Ukraine regards any negotiations on Ukraine without Ukraine as ones that have no result.
So, Zelenskyy is in a position of powerlessness with the talks, but he's desperately, of course, trying to not look totally irrelevant on the global stage as this comes to pass.
In response to that, to Zelensky's comments, Donald Trump accused Ukraine of starting the war.
Today I heard, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
Which it obviously didn't.
No, this is an extremely complicated issue. And I think the Trump point is obviously, as he always does, is delivered indelicately with absolutely no nuance. The point is, should the West be supporting Ukraine indefinitely to the tune of billions and billions and billions of dollars of military assistance in its attempts to effectively violently wrench itself away from Russia's grasp, or not? That's the point that Trump's coming in on, and he's obviously saying not. We wouldn't pay for that. And I think one of the problems that we have in countries that are very supportive of Ukraine is understandably, calibrating our support in level with the level of moral outrage that Russia's invasion ought to provoke. The reality of it all is that the Ukrainians have made quite a strong bid to join the West, to join NATO. And the risks associated with that move are huge. And whether they've been thought through is not really fair to say to the Ukrainians that they invited this. But I think the fact that the Russians might violently interject and to wage war and to absorb humongous casualties among the Russian military to actually prevent this from happening, I don't think was ever really thought through. In short, there is a compelling argument that Ukraine's bluff was called in terms of its westernizing foreign policy drive over the last few years. Now, that is not to say that Russia was provoked. That is not to say that Russia has any adequate justification for doing this. But this is geopolitics. This is geopolitics 30 years after an imperial collapse, when the USSR collapsed. It's not really for the faint-hearted.
Relations between the United States and Ukraine have broken down. The US President Donald Trump's accusing Volodymyr Zelenskyy of being a dictator without elections. Ukrainian President says Donald Trump's living in a disinformation bubble.
So unfortunately, President Trump, who we respect a lot as a leader of the nation that supported us all the time, but unfortunately, Mr. Trump lives in this disinformation space.
But Zelenskyy has done a terrible job. His country is shattered, and millions of people have unnecessarily died. And you can't bring a war to an end if you don't talk to both sides. You got to talk. They haven't been talking for 3 years.
Let's look then, Samir, at what all of this means for the US relationship with Europe in light of this rather substantial policy shift in relation to how America has dealt with Europeans for a very long time at this point.
Obviously, what the Donald Trump administration is doing in national security terms is reorienting its level of effort towards the Asia-Pacific and away from Europe. But more generally, I think the idea that Europe has to pay for its own security is, again, it's an uncomfortable home truth that's being delivered to Europeans, because I wouldn't say they've been free riding. They have militaries. They don't, France and Britain have nuclear weapons arsenals. France and Britain also have quite globally deployable armed forces. So it's not as if, the entire continent is inert as far as military capability is concerned. But I think reorienting Europe's military capability and doctrine and posture to European continental security, that's not something that we've seen since the end of the Cold War, and that's something that we're probably going to have to see in the decades to come.
So, Samir, how do you see this playing out? If Donald Trump wants to make Russia a key ally, does that mean that Europe can no longer rely on the United States? What's going to happen next?
Well, in security terms, it certainly compromises the idea that there's a Euro-American joint stand against the Russians, definitely. Some of the people around the Trump administration, they're very public about saying this, on X and in their books, is they really want a sort of, they call it a reverse Kissinger moment where they split the Russians from the Chinese, because the Russians and Chinese have this burgeoning partnership, effectively rebuilding bridges with the Russians so they can refocus on their peer-to-peer competitor challenge with the Chinese. But I think in reality, the Russians and the Chinese have a very, very long border. They have no interest in having a catastrophic breakdown in their relations. So what does that all mean? Geopolitics will be extremely complicated. It's not an us versus them. There's this one bloc and another bloc like in the Cold War. It is genuine, to use a jargonistic term, multipolarity. It's about the West being in a very different position in relation to the rest of the world, and also in relation to itself and to each other, than all the assumptions we've had growing up over the last few decades of at least some measure of Western unity in sort of a big bad world.
And the possibility of a face-to-face meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, how significant would that be?
Immense, because they haven't met since 2019, and this would be the ultimate reversal of the confrontation with Russia policy that the Biden administration and its European allies and partners pursued.
What do you think then, Samir? Is Donald Trump a threat to global security at this point?
Depends who you are. Absolutely depends who you are. He is not actually talking about starting new wars, so we're not in the realm of a George W. Bush type figure. But at the same time, if you're European, it's absolutely a negative turn of events for European security. If you're Ukrainian, all of your assumptions about American support have been quashed. It is horribly, horribly worrying. Just as a quick reminder, many other governments around the world, including India, Indonesia, Brazil, China, all advocated direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine to end this war. For years, that's been their position. And I'm not passing a judgment on that. I'm simply saying that Donald Trump's shift in US policy to direct negotiations, certainly with the Russians and the US, possibly bringing the Ukrainians on later on, may actually be welcomed by quite a large number of countries in the wider world who aren't directly affected by this invasion in the same way as the Europeans.
Dr. Samir Puri is the director of Chatham House's Centre for Global Governance and Security, and the author of Westlessness, The Great Global Rebalancing. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed, Cara Jensen-McKinnon and Adair Shepherd. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. ABC News Daily will be back again on Monday. Thanks for listening.